Hey everyone, welcome to this week's reading of Shard of the Sun. We're picking up with chapter 22, and I'll be reading 22 and 23 for this reading because they're both shorter chapters. So we'll just jump into it. Chapter 22. Kira slammed the book shut in frustration. She had read the book from beginning to end 3 times and had yet to find anything that could help her. She cursed silently and stood up, rubbing her eyes with balled fists. She stared around the room and locked her eyes on the zombie. Who was powerful enough to take over her creation? She wasn't sure. Walking into her bedroom, she thought she heard something scrabbling against the wall. She grabbed her cloak from the dresser and wrapped it around her shoulders. Lifting her hands up before her face, she cast an illusion of a man's appearance over her own. Glancing into a mirror to check that the illusion was flawless, she nodded to herself in satisfaction. She went back into the main room and grabbed her dagger off the table. Placing her leg on a chair, she slid the blade into the sheath she had sewn into her boot. Then she opened the front door and stepped out onto the street. It was night already. She was surprised at how long she had spent sifting through the book. The sky was clear, and the moon was barely a sliver in the blackness. A few lamps that illuminated the street had been lit, but they didn't provide much light. She wondered briefly if that was why all the shady types liked this area of town. She walked the cobblestone path, breathing in the cool night air. She had been taking walks late in the evening each night for the past week in the hopes of clearing her mind. This night, like the others, would prove to be futile, she knew. She wouldn't clear her mind no matter how she tried. Several passages in the book had led her to believe there might be a way to save her child, but she could find nothing definitive. Subconsciously, her hand went to her stomach and she rubbed it gently. She would die before she let her child go to that demon. She walked down the street, passing several run-down homes that lay dark and silent. The sound of stray cats fighting in an alley was close by, and muffled music and the sound of drunken people echoed a few buildings down. Listening to the sounds of the night, she noticed another noise as well. It was almost imperceptible, but Kira had walked these streets long enough to pick up on things that might seem ordinary to others. She hadn't stayed alive by her magic alone. She began to step cautiously, not sure of where the sound had come from. After a few minutes, she realized she was being followed. Whoever it was, they did well to conceal themselves, but she could hear the soft pitter-patter of their footsteps. If they won't reveal themselves, I'll make them, she thought. Kira turned down an alley. Ducking behind a wooden crate, she pushed herself up against the wall, using the natural shadows to hide her body. The footsteps quickened. She reached down and unsheathed the dagger hidden in her boot. Clutching the hilt tightly, she waited. Footsteps stopped, and a moment later she thought she lost her follower. She held her breath and listened intently. Moving as slowly and as quietly as she could, she placed her feet in a stance that would allow her to rush whoever walked past the crate. The footsteps resumed, slower this time. She held the pose so long her legs started to burn. She could feel her palm getting sweaty as well. Hurry up! An involuntary tremor began in her right leg. She tried to adjust her position to alleviate the strain on her muscles, to no avail. Suddenly a figure stepped past the crate. Kira drew her dagger back and launched herself forward. A scream echoed through the alley, and Kira pushed the person's head down onto the ground, using her knee to pin the figure down. Kira thought her stalker seemed small, too small. It might not even be a person. Fear fluttered within her stomach as she considered what kind of creature it could be. The thing struggled against her, flailing wildly. Kira looked out into the street to make sure the scream hadn't attracted any attention. She didn't see anyone. The scream sounded human, but she knew of many creatures that could imitate a human's voice. Gritting her teeth, she lifted the dagger above her head and drove it down with all her might. Blood spurted over her hand and onto her leg as the blade cut through the back of the creature's neck. She jerked the blade free and stabbed again, severing the spine. The flailing abruptly ended. Breathing heavily, she fell backward off the thing, and wiped the dagger on her cloak before resheathing it. She sat there for a moment to calm her racing heart, then stood up and tried to inspect the body. The darkness of the alley made it too hard to see, so she grabbed the thing's feet, which she noticed had shoes on, and pulled it out into the light of the street. Kira gasped in horror and felt her stomach wrench. She turned her head and vomited. She spat several times to get the nasty bile out of her mouth and hesitantly looked back at the body. It was Claire. Chapter 23. Morrill stood on the balcony of his room that afforded him a view overlooking the city. Ravendale was vulnerable now. As the priest considered that thought, he laughed aloud. The city had always been vulnerable, but people just didn't know it. The church had become a place to gain wealth and power. That was one of the many reasons Morrill had entered the priesthood in the first place, and he had gained much of both. Yet now he found himself bound like a slave to the will of the foul wizard Farron. The shard, Morrill had come to realize, had not saved him from dying without a price. Part of his soul now resided in that stone. It wouldn't be such a bad thing if he himself had control of the shard. Fortunately, that fool Broderick had lost it to Farron. In the distance, he could see the short wall that surrounded the city. It wasn't much protection, but it was enough to give the people some peace of mind. Once the failing of the shield had become public knowledge, people began to panic. Like little scared sheep, the priest said to himself. He had yet to hear any word from Kira. While Farron possessed the shard, Morrill believed that if anyone could take it back, it would be Broderick. The woodsman had found it, after all. Until Farron lost control of it, Morrill and the others were bound by the power of the shard to obey the wizard. And now Farron had ordered him to send his best priest to the ruins of the Starforge Mountains. He had considered replacing some of the priests with assassins. They could kill the wizard and bring in the shard. But he finally decided that would not be the best course of action. Farron might suspect betrayal, and Morrill wasn't sure if the wizard could read his thoughts through the shard or not. Reluctantly, he had sent just the priests. He didn't know why Farron needed them, but he speculated it wasn't for anything good. A knock sounded on the door behind him. "What is it?" he demanded. He heard the door open. "The priests have departed, as you asked." It was Justice. Morrill turned to face him. The younger priest had been acting odd ever since the shield had fallen. "Good." Justice bowed and started to leave, but Morrill told him to stay. "Have you ever seen the city from this view?" he asked Justice. "I have not." "Come and look upon my city," Morrill said, motioning him to come to the balcony. Justice hesitated for a moment, then obeyed. They stood staring in silence. "It's beautiful," Justice said finally. Morrill smirked. The man was a soft-hearted fool. "You remember the day the shield fell?" Morrill asked. "How could I forget?" Justice replied. "You almost died and we were attacked by goblins." "I did die," Morrill replied, chuckling. "An interesting experience, to be sure. Have you ever come close to death?" Justice stiffened at the question. "No, never." Morrill stared hard at Justice, but the younger priest evaded his gaze. "The man Broderick. You remember him as well." Justice nodded slowly. "I do. He saved your life. He's a hero among some of the priests." Morrill snorted in derision. "Hardly. He didn't do anything of his own power. Tell me, did you release him?" Justice's face reddened, and he met Morrill's steely gaze with his own. "Why would I betray the church?" he asked defiantly. "I didn't ask if you betrayed the church. I'm asking if you betrayed me. Before you try to lie, remember that you are held accountable to the oaths you made when you joined the priesthood." "What of yourself?" Justice demanded angrily. "I have heard the rumors spoken in secret. You are a murderer and a coward. What of your vows? Do they mean nothing to you?" Realizing what he said, he turned his eyes back out toward the city and lowered his head. "Forgive me," he murmured. Morrill casually stepped behind Justice. "I had my fingers crossed when I made my vows," he whispered. Before Justice could turn around, Morrill grabbed the priest and pushed him over the railing. Justice Free fell 50 feet and smashed hard into the street below. Morrill looked down at him and saw a crowd beginning to gather around the body. He smiled. "That made me feel better," he thought. A searing pain suddenly shot through his neck. He grabbed at it desperately and cried out. It was a pain like nothing he had ever felt before. Falling to his knees, he screamed, and then just as suddenly, the pain was gone. Morrill collapsed onto the floor of his balcony, and there was only darkness. All right, that's it for this week. Hope you guys are enjoying this book. As always, I say that, but really do. It was interesting to come back to this, especially reading one of these chapters. I thought someone else died in this book, not the person that did. But anyways, I guess shows what happens when you wrote a book like over 10 years ago, and you know. Anyways, all right, cool. We will be back next week with chapter 24. So, See you guys next week.